So one of the things that I do throughout the year with the books that I read, that I have, is I make a stack of them somewhere in my room. At the end of the year or the beginning of the next year, I make a video of all of the books that I read, just like physically looking at them. And at the beginning of the year, what I like to do is reorganize and kind of clean my bookshelves and put the books that I've read onto the shelf that houses all of the books that I've read, and kind of go through the books that are on my TBR shelf behind me, and get rid of the ones that are no longer interesting to me, and just kind of reorganize everything. This year, I decided to go through and kind of catalog everything in a Google spreadsheet. When I cataloged all of my unread books, I also kind of made note of some of like the shortest books that I own, the longest books I own, oldest, newest, etc. And I kind of wanted to share those statistics with you today because I find them interesting, and I think it might be fun in the future for me to challenge myself to read all of my longest books, or read all of my oldest books in maybe a month or a couple months. Yeah, let's just get into it. So to start off with, I have 226 unread books. Let's start by going through my longest and my shortest books. The average length of the books on my TBR shelf is about 350 pages. So let's just talk about the outliers. So the very, very big books and the very, very small books. So for this section, there are exceptions. Kind of when I was going through, I just chose like the top and the bottom 5, but within size range, I was thinking, well, a lot of my biggest books are books that are anthologies, and a lot of my smallest books are books that are poetry collections. So I'm going to include those, but also kind of have the 5 biggest books that aren't anthologies, and then the 5 smallest books that aren't poetry collections. Among my biggest books are a lot of anthologies, including William Trevor, The Collected Stories. This was a gift from my grandfather a couple Christmases ago, and it is 1,261 pages long. It's massive. It's like really heavy. I've never heard of William Trevor. I've never read any of his works, so this is kind of incredibly daunting, but it's something that I hope one day I'm going to decide to like set this out on my desk and like read a story every day for as long as it takes to get through this. We would then have Sherlock Holmes, Volume 1 and Volume 2, The Collected Novels and Stories by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Now, I'm currently 2/3 of the way through the first volume of this. This singular Volume 1 is 1,059 pages, and this second volume is 737 pages, which together is about 1,796 pages long. So while they're 2 separate books, I kind of think of them as the same thing. On Goodreads, they're just 1 volume. So yeah, I can't remember the last time I picked this up. I think it was a year or 2 ago, when I was in the habit of reading a story every single day. The last largest anthology that I have is Poetry of the Victorian Period. This is, as it says, just poetry of the Victorian period. I was in a Victorian class in college two years ago, and really enjoyed the poetry that I read, and I saw this at a vintage store, and it had a syllabus inside from a class from like the 80s, which I thought was really cool, so I just decided to pick it up. I don't know if I'll ever actually read this, but I have it. So this collection, this anthology, is 1,057 pages long. Now onto the novels. We have War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy, which is huge. It's 1,215 pages and is about Napoleon invading Russia and a illegitimate son of a count who's trying to kind of stake his claim and get his inheritance, a prince who leaves his family to go fight in the war, and a girl that they both fall for. It's War and Peace. I would like to read it in my lifetime. I really enjoyed Anna Karenina when I read it, which is really due for a reread. But yeah. Next up, we have Gone with the Wind by Margaret Mitchell, which comes to 959 pages. And this is about a very wealthy family in the South during the Civil War and Reconstruction, and kind of what that does to this family. Next, we have Don Quixote by Miguel de Cervantes, and this is a book translated from Spanish, and it is about a man who is obsessed with stories about knights and kind of chivalry and goes a little bit insane. Next on my list is Tom Jones by Henry Fielding, which is 886 pages long. This is just a classic comic novel about Tom Jones, who was a foundling, and seems to be about his romantic and other pursuits. So the last longest book that I'm going to talk about is Underworld by Don DeLillo, which is about American culture, kind of especially the effects of the Cold War and the 50s and 60s on American people. Now on to the shortest books that are on my to-be-read shelf. Again, like with my longest books, like noticing that there are a lot of long anthologies, there are a lot of short poetry collections. So I'm going to go through those first and then go through the next 5 shortest books. At 47 pages, we have Brand New Ancients by Kate Tempest. Kate Tempest is a performance poet in London, and this is kind of a imagining of ancient Greek figures, maybe gods and goddesses, in contemporary London. I really enjoyed reading Let Them Eat Chaos by Kate Tempest, which is another poetry book of hers. Next, we have Food by Gertrude Stein at 55 pages. This is part of the Penguin modern, like, little green books. And this is just a collection of Gertrude Stein's poems that are about food. I think it should be charming. And lastly, we have Something Permanent, photographs by Walker Evans and poetry by Cynthia Rylant. This is a photo book that is coupled with poems about the Great Depression and American living at this time. And this is 61 pages long. Now, for the not poetry books, we have The London Scene by Virginia Woolf. This is a collection of 5 essays about London, and it is 44 pages long. And then at 65 pages, we have On Being Different, What It Means to Be a Homosexual by Merle Miller. This is about being gay in America and kind of stemmed from a article or response that Merle Miller wrote in a newspaper a couple years after the Stonewall riots. I think just an important piece of LGBTQ history. Ethan Frome by Edith Wharton, which is 77 pages long, and this is about Ethan and his wife, who is ailing. So Ethan's cousin comes to be her companion, and then some romantic things ensue. It's short. I have read a couple of short stories by Edith Wharton that I've enjoyed. We then have My Mortal Enemy by Willa Cather. This is 85 pages long and is about a woman who decides to marry for love instead of money, and kind of what happens with that, and seems to be a commentary about marriage and maybe like individualism within marriage. And lastly, The Radical Women Manifesto, Socialist Feminist Theory, Program, and Organizational Structure, which is 86 pages long. And this is something that I picked up in a thrift store. It is the manifesto of a feminist socialist group, Radical Women, which I believe is founded in Seattle. Yeah, that's it. All right, next up we have kind of the oldest and the newest books that are in my collection. There isn't necessarily a time period that is incredibly more represented than any other. I do have a lot of books that are published in the 1990s and a lot of Victorian books. My oldest book is The Odyssey by Homer, which is The Odyssey, followed or kind of tied with Greek drama, which is edited and collected by Moses Hadis, but this includes drama by Sophocles, Euripides, Aristophanes, which would have been written around the same time as The Odyssey. And The Odyssey was written around 700 BC. We then have the Decameron by Giovanni Boccaccio, which was written in 1353 and is about a group of young people who flee or are sent away from either Florence or Rome, I think Florence, because of the Black Death, and they pass their time by telling stories to each other. Next, we have Julius Caesar, which was written in 1599 by William Shakespeare, and this is one of his historical plays about Julius Caesar. And the last, oldest book that I'm going to talk about is Macbeth by William Shakespeare as well, which was written in 1606 and follows Macbeth and Lady Macbeth and Scottish history, kind of. Now on to the newest books. So basically these are the 5-6 books I have that were published in 2018 and 2019. So first we have What Would Boudica Do by E. Foley and B. Coates. Everyday Problems Solved by History's Most Remarkable Women. This is a kind of like a collection of essays that talks about significant female figures in history and like what would they do now, or how they approached problems that contemporary people maybe face. We then have Girl with Death Mask by Jennifer Given, and this is a poetry collection about love, tequila, sex, first periods, late nights, abuse, and heartache, and is kind of like a coming of age poetry collection with like 4 parts. Next is All We Know of Pleasure, Poetic Erotica by Women, collected and edited by Enid Schamer, which I love this cover a lot, but this is, as it says, poetic erotica. And then we have Milkman by Anna Burns, which was the Man Booker Prize winner from 2018. And this is about a woman who is being followed by a paramilitary called the Milkman, and kind of what happens with that. Next are my 2019 books, both of which were gifts, one from my grandpa, one from my mom. So this is Wild Mercy, Living the Fierce and Tender Wisdom of the Women Mystics by Mirabai Starr. And this kind of looks at female goddesses and archetypes, and looking at the feminine and like feminine knowledge and power as seen in history and religion and culture. Next, we have Girl, Woman, Other by Bernardine Evaristo, which was the 2019 winner of the Booker Prize. Bernardine Evaristo is the first Black woman to have won this prize, and this is about the intersections of identity for Black British women. Now we get on to kind of the last category, which is Goodreads rating. These are the lowest and highest rated books on my TBR shelf. The average reading of all of the books that I own is about a 3.9, which I think is pretty good. We're gonna start with the lowest rated books, leading up to the lowest. So first we have Queer City by Peter Ackroyd at 3.32 stars. This is kind of a queer history of London. I started reading this while I was in London. Did I finish it? No. Then we have That Inevitable Victorian Thing by E.K. Johnson. This is a YA speculative book about if the British Empire never fell and what that would mean, and so kind of joins ideas of the British Empire with ideas of like innovation and technology. And this has some queer elements. This is at 3.22 stars. Next is The Postern of Fate by Agatha Christie. This is a Tommy and Tuppence novel about a set of books, one of which has a mysterious message that says Mary Jordan did not die naturally, and so what comes of that. And this is also at 3.22 stars. Then we have Shylock Is My Name by Howard Jacobson, which is part of the like Hogarth Shakespeare retellings, and this is a retelling of The Merchant of Venice, following Shylock. And the lowest rated book on my TBR, I don't find surprising because I think this is a very divisive poet, is Food by Gertrude Stein, at 2 stars. Gertrude Stein, I have found, both in the poetry classes that I've taken and in the other classes I've taken where we've had to read Gertrude Stein, people don't like Gertrude Stein. I personally really do. I find her poems playful and fun, so I think I'm going to enjoy this, but I also understand why people might not. Now onto the highest rated books on my TBR. So at 4.51 stars, we have the collected novels and stories of Sherlock Holmes. This follows Sherlock Holmes and John Watson as they solve mysteries in England. Mostly in London, but kind of elsewhere as well. And also at 4.51 stars, we have The Madness Face by Andrea Gibson. And this is one of their poetry collections. I really like the poems that I've seen them perform. They're a pretty well-known spoken word poet or slam poet, and so I want to get to this. Next, at 4.52 stars, is another poetry collection, Don't Call Us Dead by Danez Smith, which is about him and his experiences and the experience he has with community, living as a gay HIV positive man in London, maybe. I've heard nothing but amazing things about this, and also that I know that I can find videos of him performing his works and that he's great. Next, at 4.63 stars, we have Marie Acquis, Radical Politics and Outlaw Passions by Michael Hellquist. This is a book that I almost did not keep. One of my good friends is in Germany right now, and when he was packing to go, he had a bunch of books that he was giving away. And I took the responsibility of taking the books that nobody wanted in order to kind of donate them to the library. But I flipped through this one and decided to keep it. This is about Marie Acquis, who was a physician for the working class, a lesbian, and a fiercely independent activist unafraid to take risks or stand by her principles. Lastly, the highest rated book on my TBR is also one of the newest things that I acquired. It was given to me for Christmas, and that is American Indian Women by Patrick Duvall. And this is an anthropological look into the lives of American Indian women and the ways in which women have remained marginalized within an already marginalized community in the States. And this is at 4.69 stars. So thanks for hanging out with me, for listening to some of these statistics. I found it interesting to go through my shelves and just see what it is that I have, what it is that I can look forward to reading, and yeah, I'll see you in another video.